Good morning, and welcome to my neighborhood. Figuratively speaking, of course. What's the difference between the Marvellous Mrs. Maisel series and Dr. Bonnie Henry's briefings? We're all excitedly looking forward to the next season of the Marvellous Mrs. Maisel. Okay, so today we're talking about, what are we talking about? We're talking about the Marvellous Mrs. Maisel and Dr. Bonnie Henry, who is the Chief Medical Health Officer of British Columbia and regularly, 2 times a week at least, has been doing briefings on COVID for the province of British Columbia. The Marvellous Mrs. Maisel is a show that's been running on Prime, Amazon funded, that chronicles a stand-up comic. And one of the writers of this show says that the main character, Mrs. Maisel, was patterned after her father. And she made her into a 28-year-old beautiful young woman. "You're welcome, Dad," she says. And it works. But why are we talking about these two characters together? We're talking about both of them because they both do stand-up. In the case of Mrs. Maisel, she starts doing stand-up in a club in response to a trauma in her life where her husband had been doing stand-up and she just ends up there, gets on the stage and does it. And for the rest of the series, she refines it. Very well done. The concept of standing naked on the stage, but for your wondrous wardrobe and jewelry, your infinite wardrobe and jewelry, only rivaled by the Bridgertons, I think, series. Where does Bonnie Henry fit into all this? Bonnie Henry stands up without an audience. It's pandemic times. She does it virtually. Doesn't get the feedback, the heckling, but she does get journalistic questions, which border from excellent to inane. And both these characters handle both the responses with some aplomb. And Bonnie Henry does a good job with a very quiet humor. Whereas Mrs. Maisel, a little bit more punch and trying to pull the laughs. And that's it. Bonnie Henry's not doing this for laughs. But both of them have the same problem. Both of them are dealing with tough topics, taboos, and dealing with impossible subjects, really. And they'll be lucky if anybody listens, let alone tells anybody else. So, that would be just good if that went further. But it's a lovely juxtaposition in many ways, because we're talking about how women are perceived in the late 50s in a public persona kind of role, and how they're perceived in 2001. Has it really changed that much? Why does the wardrobe matter so much, and the jewelry? I mean, both of these characters, Mrs. Maisel and Dr. Henry, do really well in terms of their wardrobe. But Mrs. Maisel, I think, has a little bit more help than Bonnie Henry. Having watched the entire series of the Marvellous Mrs. Maisel, I was starting to notice the structure of the writing of the show, the writing of the stand-up bits, you know, the characterizations, the vignettes of Lenny Bruce being in there and sort of telegraphing the punch. Jane Jacobs showing up, just in a couple of places, not just one. And I started to see a pattern. And that's what led me to the comparison with Bonnie Henry. Because occasionally somebody else came in and subbed for Bonnie Henry, and they were fine. But there was something missing. And very often, almost always, Bonnie Henry does these briefings in conjunction with the health minister, Adrian Dix. And he appears to have a large wardrobe of ties. You know, dark suit, button-up white shirt, and varying ties. Whereas Bonnie Henry has to have appropriately coordinated outfits and jewelry, and has been much loved for the way she presents. And you have to kind of wonder what's different here. So, after thinking about this, letting it kind of digest for a little while, I realized that there was a book that I'd read many years ago. It was published in 1967, written by Arthur Koestler. And in spite of the lack of explicit connection, I'd always thought about it as a treatise on humor, which in fact it wasn't. But I still do. Arthur Koestler, in his 1967 book called The Ghost in the Machine, dealt with this sort of dualism of Descartes and materialism of Ryle. He talked about the idea that people want to both stand out and be immersed in the many. They want to be part of their society, part of their group, but they also want to be individuals and stand out. So he took this to a much larger context in terms of everything from atoms to the universe, in looking at things as being whole and things as being part. Now at that point, he was looking at things in particular as a hierarchy, but in 1978, I believe, he published a book called Janus, in which he followed up on this and just started to touch on what we now call complex systems. This is where the interactions may have loops in them and may come back again and are not in a strict hierarchy, necessarily. And it changes the way you think about these things. So, the other feature that he talked about was how this desire to stand alone and be part of a group with all its rules and social rules and language and philosophy, governance, run at odds with each other, and how it is that humans have a tendency, both individually and collectively, to be self-destructive. I know, this sounds very serious. But if you look at both the Marvellous Mrs. Maisel and Dr. Bonnie Henry's briefings, you'll find some similarities. The bottom line is that both are dealing with this conflict between I, the individual that's alone in the universe, sometimes more alone than not these days, standing out, wanting to stand out, wanting to be yourself. And the juxtaposition of the society in which we live. And perhaps that's the difference between Bonnie Henry and the other presenters. Bonnie Henry is an interesting person in that she's owned a restaurant. I think she's still at least part owner of a winery in the interior. She's written books. She's traveled extensively around the world. She loves to travel, she says. When she speaks, she always talks about individual and group. She has quite a deep understanding of this relative to pandemics. She's been through, this is her third pandemic, and I guess the third wave in the pandemic. But she was in Africa for EBOLA. She was in Toronto for SARS. And she's in British Columbia for SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19. So this is their third time round at being in a pandemic, or potential pandemic in the case of SARS and EBOLA. So she always talks about, or talks to, it's the ravens. Big ravens. Talking to each other in the tops of the trees. I hope you can hear them. So she always talks to the individual and the community. She doesn't talk about herd immunity. She talks about community immunity. She talks about the individual constraints and how they impact individuals, their families, their sports teams, their communities. And she is very careful to include this in every part of the factual information from the scientific reports that she's delivering. Her byline is be kind, be calm, and be safe. So, Mrs. Maisel also talks about these juxtapositions. And both of them talk about them quite often in a first-person way. Bonnie Henry talks about marathons and wanting to travel, and Mrs. Maisel talks about the things you're not supposed to talk about when you're a 28-year-old woman in 1958. She talks about sex. She talks about all the taboos. childcare and husbands and in-laws and fathers and things that are supposed to be secret. And both of these stand-ups are not just talking about this conflict between individuality and community. And of course, it isn't just about individuality and community, it's about running into people that are all about themselves or running into people that are all about community, whether it be civic, religious, corporate. I mean, you see these things all the time. People have different ideas. They have different ideas of who they are and how they interact with other people. And it's that weaving, that mesh, that complexity of response. For instance, Bonnie Henry says, okay, we're maybe going to open up a little bit in a month. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And what do people do? They immediately jump the gun and do it now. And she's trying to give them a reward for doing something well in the future, something to look forward to. And again, we've seen otherwise rational and intelligent people just immediately go, okay, I'll do it now. And there's a lot of people that don't, but a surprising number that do. And so the setup for the jokes, both ways, briefing and show, are that you create an expectation, you create a background, you create the story. And then you break it. You set up the things that are forbidden, are taboo, are dangerous. I think that's why they introduced Lenny Bruce into the show, because Lenny Bruce was the rebel, the quintessential rebel. He really changed it from Bob Hope and those guys that just got on stage and said a lot of jokes. He started talking truth to power. And well, the police haven't come and dragged Bonnie Henry off because under a state of emergency, she is the power. She can make essentially laws, temporarily, that affect everybody in the province. Whereas when the Marvellous Mrs. Maisel starts using profanity or displaying a little bit too much skin, in one instance, gets dragged off to jail, just like Lenny Bruce. So there's differences, you know. It's hard doing briefings, and likely Bonnie Henry has done more stand-up in reality than Mrs. Maisel has done fictionally. Bonnie has no audience. She has a big audience, but the only feedback she gets is from the journalists. And I must say that even when she's asked questions that she's already addressed in her presentation very thoroughly, and there's nothing more to say, she does a really good job of taking the opportunity that the questions provide to reiterate, to elaborate, but not to get angry. And it's got to be hard sometimes. What I've noticed in the Mrs. Maisel show is it isn't, you know, the stand-up is intermittent. It's just little features happen throughout the show, but the entire show is framed in the same way. It's about is kind of self-destructive periodicity that humans seem to go through no matter what their state or place in life, and how they interact with the others in their lives while trying to deal with this propensity. The idea of the joke dealing with the self-destructive tendencies that people have, dealing with the things that they don't want to face, and then twisting them and crashing them down, is useful. You know, it's the entire basis for the show. The show gets wrapped, and again, all the storylines play with this idea of self and group. Which groups colliding, individuals colliding, rules colliding, positions in society colliding. Bonnie Henry, she's trying very hard to make this work, and for the most part succeeding, we hope. So, I don't know. Just an introduction, just a thought about what is humor? Where does that come from? How does it matter? How much has changed for women since the late 50s in terms of influence that they have to have a deep and good wardrobe, that they get shoes named after them, the Bonnie Henry with Fluvog. Didn't see any Adrian Dix shoes. Why is it that things have changed so little in so long? But it's not just about that. It's about this dualism, Descartes, Koestler, and more. And by the way, his second book, Janus, is I think a Roman god, two-faced Roman god. One face looks in, introspectively. The other face looks out. This is not a new idea. None of this is new. Neither is humor, neither is jokes. Jokes are short stories that have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and usually there's a twist in the middle, so they're hard to remember. They're not something that you quite expect. And I guess that sums up the pandemic. So does that mean that viruses have a sense of humor? Maybe they do. People keep talking about government and capitalism and all these kind of things, but I think that perhaps they all come down to this. They all come down to humor. They all come down to the basis of humor, which is this self-destructive crossover that happens between wanting to be and wanting to be immersed in the society in which we live. And all the interactions that come with that with other individuals and groups and societies and stuff. So maybe if we look at it that way, we've got something to hold on to. I'm very grateful to all of you. Thank you for watching. Click subscribe, like, click on the bell if you want to be notified. And yeah. Grateful for Bonnie Henry and all the people that have been working so hard during the pandemic. And very grateful for the people that produced, funded, wrote, acted, and otherwise made a marvelous show in the Marvellous Mrs. Maisel. Sometimes, by doing historical fiction, you can talk about things that we can't even yet talk about in our times. It's not the specific things so much as the implications, the model that they're creating of again and again, showing us the same thing again and again, that we talk about the things that are self-destructive. We talk about how they relate between us, between the groups, between our morals, our language, our philosophies, our religions. So, I think being grateful is important. It maybe mitigates a little bit the self-destructive nature. Imagine what we could do if, and it isn't just a fixed thing. It varies. It changes depending on all manner of pressures. So the trick is we can do amazing things as a collective. We can do amazing things together. How do we balance these things? Maybe we start by being grateful. Maybe we start by laughing. Maybe we start with humor. Maybe we start with curiosity. What did you notice today that you're grateful for that you've never noticed before? Have a great day. We'll see you next time.